Okay folks, it's about that time. Time to make some boost. Okay, so today we're going to start the much anticipated turbo upgrade on my BMW E46, aka the Basket Case BMW. Fair warning, I think I've got the bird flu or something, so my voice is going to sound a little grungy. Anyway, if you've been following the channel, then you've probably seen how I did all the supporting mods for the turbo before installing the turbo. So, for example, we completely redid the entire suspension. We installed a limited slip rear differential. We reinforced the subframe. We built a custom transmission that'll handle the extra power of a boosted engine. And last but not least, we did some upgrades to the engine to improve the oiling. I did all these mods first before installing the turbo, because I don't want to be chasing my tail fixing broken stuff. And by the way, I have videos on all of that. Basically, this entire project is chronicled on YouTube. Okay, so let's talk about the turbo swap. I actually decided to do the turbo upgrade in two phases. Phase 1 is going to be a cheap, simple, basic turbo install. Phase 2 is going to be what I consider a proper turbo install. And in this video, we're going to start with Phase 1. Basically, the goal of the cheap basic turbo swap is to get a turbo into your E46 BMW for roughly the same cost as a cam upgrade. And let's face it, aftermarket cams for these engines are not cheap. So for example, a pair of Schrick sport cams with miscellaneous other stuff you'll need to install, like maybe some gaskets or some sealer, etc. It's probably going to set you back about $1,500. So I'm going to try to do this turbo swap for about $1,500. Let's see how it goes. Okay, so to keep the costs down on the cheap simple turbo swap, we're going to have to make some compromises. So for example, we are not going to use an intercooler. We are going to use the stock mass airflow sensor. We're also going to try to use the stock fuel pump. And that's going to limit how much boost we can use, or at least how much we can use safely. And it's also going to limit the power production of the setup. But still, it's going to make more power than a cam upgrade. So, since we're not using an intercooler and our fuel system is not going to support a whole lot of horsepower, we're only going to run about 5 or 6 psi of boost. Now, I know some people are going to chime in and say, oh, that's not even worth the effort, why bother? Okay, let's do some math. 5 or 6 psi of boost on this engine is going to give you about 75 horsepower at the crankshaft. At the wheels, that's probably going to be about 60 horsepower. Compare that to a cam upgrade, the Schrick Sport cams, which might give you about 15 or 20. Okay, anyway, enough of that. Let's talk about the parts that we're going to be using in the cheap, simple turbo install. Of course, we're going to be using a cheap, simple turbo manifold. I got this on eBay. We're also going to be using a cheap turbo, which I also got on eBay. We're doing this to keep the costs down, because keep in mind, we're working with a price point. And since these cheap parts are, well, cheap, that means we're going to have to put some elbow grease into them to make them usable. For example, these manifolds are notorious for the mounting flange being warped. They're also notorious for cracking, so we're going to have to address those issues. Also, these cheap turbos. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I'm using an internal wastegate turbo for simplicity, so I don't have to, like, make a custom pipe for the wastegate to attach to and stuff. Anyway, these turbos are notorious for the internal wastegate not being very effective, so the turbo suffers boost creep. We're going to have to address that. So before we can install these parts, we first have to fix them. Okay, so in this episode, my goal is to install the turbo manifold, get the turbo attached to it, and get the motor mount installed. Oh, and in case you're wondering, this right here is a motor mount. This part was not cheap. Actually, this is made by Rally Road. It's going to install on the right side of the car underneath the turbo manifold, right in front of the turbo, and this part of the motor mount is actually designed to provide room for the intake pipe going into the turbo. Okay folks, here is our turbo manifold. I got this on eBay pretty cheap, and unfortunately it has a couple issues. First of all, the mounting flange is not perfectly flat. It's got a little bit of a warp. There's a high spot in the center here. If I take this level, let's see if I can get this on video. You see that? Yeah, so I'm going to take it to a machine shop, have them shave that flat. Also, you can probably see all the casting flash in between the runners. These are spots where cracks can start, so I want to grind that stuff off. On some parts of the manifold, you can see the manufacturer made an attempt to grind off some of the casting flash, but in areas like here, we still have sharp edges, and these are also places where cracks can form, so I still need to grind this stuff smooth. Okay, so I've been to several machine shops to see if they can mill that thing flat, and they all told me, sorry, we don't have the machinery to do that. So, we're going with plan B. Okay, that only took about an hour, but anyway, the casting flash is all ground off, and also these sharp edges are nice and rounded off now. So it should be good to go, at least on the cracking front. Okay, so now we're moving on to the exhaust ports. And they're kind of rough. Actually, if you see right here, there's like a lump in this port right there. Also, these guys are just generally pretty rough. And we got some kind of casting irregularity there. Got some stuff in there. Yep, and I just want to clean it up a little bit. So once again, this will reduce the airflow restriction. Granted, it will only be a slight reduction, but as they say, every little bit helps. Okay, now comes the part I have not been looking forward to, and that is flattening out the mounting flange on this manifold. Now, once again, this thing is warped. It's actually bowed up in the middle, so we need to knock down the middle part of the manifold. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a local machine shop willing to take on the task, so we're going with the nuclear option. Now, obviously, this is not going to be very precise, so I'm going to have to go slow. We'll grind on it a little bit, check it with a feeler gauge, grind it a little bit more, and so on and so forth. Also, side note, I was originally going to use these gaskets with the manifold. These are OEM replacement gaskets for a BMW M52 engine. But these are made to work with a precisely machined exhaust manifold, which that is not. So, we're going to pivot to these guys. These are OEM replacement manifold gaskets. for a BMW M50 engine. As you can see, they're metal on one side, they're composite on the other. And from what I'm told, the composite material can soak up some imperfections. So we're going to try these out. Okay, that turned out better than I had hoped, actually. Once again, I would sand it a little bit with the belt sander, then I would stop and check it with a straight edge, see if I can get a feeler gauge under there. My smallest feeler gauge is 10 thousandths of an inch, and right now I'm at a point where I can't get the feeler gauge underneath here at any point. So I think that should be good to go. But anyway, once again, these gaskets should be able to soak up some imperfections because, well, you know, I just hit it with a belt sander. And also, I'm going to use some of this stuff, just to be sure. Okay, I want to do one last thing with the manifold, and that is I want to make a relief cut right down the center of the flange. You see, obviously, this manifold is going to get really hot. And as it heats and cools, it's going to expand and contract. And since this is a pretty long piece, that means the two ends of the flange are going to move quite a bit as they heat and cool, and that could contribute to gasket failure. So I'm going to cut basically an expansion joint right down the middle, and that should help alleviate that issue. Okay, so the manifold is basically done. We just need to clean it up and put a coat of paint on it. Okay, we'll let this sit and dry for a bit, and in the meantime, let's work on the turbo. Alright, let's talk about the turbo. Actually, first, let's talk about the gaskets. You see, the turbo came with the gasket, and the manifold also came with the gasket. You would expect them to be the same, but they're not. Now, this gasket does not fit the manifold very well, and ironically, it doesn't fit the turbo all that great either. So, alright, so here is our turbo gasket. Okay, so let's put our gasket on top of the turbo and see how well that fits up. It's actually not that bad. Now you can see I already traced around it with a Sharpie marker, so now you can see that the width and the height of the opening in the turbo is actually pretty good. I don't think we need to modify that at all. But you can see there is some discrepancy in the corners. Now, this material on the side walls of the opening is not very thick, so I don't think I can just hog this out. If I do, it'll make the material paper thin, and actually, I might even break through. So instead of trying to hog this out, I'm just going to try to round off that edge to make it more aerodynamic. Now I don't want to do that with the exhaust housing still on the turbo, because a bunch of junk is going to fall down into the turbo, and that's not good. So we're going to detach the exhaust housing from the turbo. To do that, we just need to undo this big old clamp right here, and also we need to detach the wastegate actuator over here. The wastegate actuator has this little retainer clip right here. We can pop it off with a pocket screwdriver. Dang it. Okay, so now that the exhaust housing is removed from the turbo, we can go ahead and do some grinding on it. But before we do that, let's talk about one more thing. We need to talk about the wastegate port. Obviously, this turbo has an internal wastegate, and that is the port right there. The exhaust gases, of course, are going to be going this way into the turbo, and when that wastegate opens, those exhaust gases need to make a 90-degree turn to go down into the wastegate port. Now, unfortunately, when they drilled the wastegate port, they just drilled a straight through hole, which means right here there's a sharp edge. So when the exhaust gas is coming through and the wastegate opens and it needs to make that turn down into the port, it's basically falling off a cliff right here, and then it smashes into the other side of the port. That's not good for wastegate flow, and it's probably going to cause boost creep. So what we want to do is, right about here, we want to round that off. Think of it like the short turn radius in a cylinder port head, in a cylinder head port. We want to encourage that air to make that turn to go down into the port. Okay, and here is the other end of the wastegate port. Once again, the exhaust gases are coming through like this, and then as they come out that wastegate port, they're going to go out that way to the exhaust pipe. So to help with wastegate flow, what I want to do is this area right here, I just want to lay it back a little bit. Basically, we're going to take this hole, which is a straight through hole, and we're going to give it a little bit of an angle like so. And that's going to encourage the exhaust gas to go out this way. Now, we don't want to grind on it too much because we don't want to compromise the seal. So in summary, we're doing three things with the exhaust housing. We're going to round off these corners a little bit to make them more aerodynamic. We're also going to round out the inlet into the wastegate port. And last but not least, we're going to lay back that one edge of the wastegate port outlet. Alright, we've got the gasket sitting on the turbo and looks pretty good. Once again, this is not for big power. This is just to improve the exhaust flow and make the turbo more responsive. Okay, now let's move on to the wastegate port. Okay, we're making progress. This will be difficult to show on camera, but on this edge now, we have a nice radius going in there. And also on the sides here, we smoothed out that sharp edge, so now the exhaust gas can just drop right in the port. Okay, and on the other end of the wastegate port, you can see we laid back this edge just a little bit. Once again, the exhaust gases are coming out that way. So we want to open it up over here, and maybe a little bit here and a little bit over there. You don't want to open it up back here because the airflow isn't really there. All you're going to do is create a dead spot. Okay, so now we can see just how much we improved that wastegate port. If we look at it at just the right angle, we can see all the way through to the other side. We couldn't do that before. Okay, so off camera I cleaned off all the metal shavings and stuff, and now the exhaust housing is ready to reinstall. Alright, the exhaust housing is reinstalled on the turbo. The next step will be to reinstall the wastegate actuator. Now, this is the one that came with the turbo, but I'm not going to reinstall this. First of all, it's not adjustable, so I can't adjust the boost. Second of all, I think this is set for like 20 psi, and that's way too much. So, we got this adjustable actuator. The spring inside here is replaceable, and I got a replacement spring. The one that came in this, I think, is 8 psi. Or at least that's what the eBay ad said. But I'm going to put a 5-pound spring in it just to keep things safe, because keep in mind we're working within the confines of the stock fuel pump and also the stock mass airflow sensor. So I want to keep the boost low, and in the future maybe we can turn the boost up. Okay, so our turbo is reassembled with our adjustable wastegate actuator, and our manifold has a fresh coat of paint. So finally we can start with the turbo install. Okay, so I was about to install the turbo and I noticed the wastegate actually doesn't open that far. It's hitting the back of the housing. Okay, so the material right here is pretty thick, so we should be able to grind a recess into this to give the flapper valve a little bit more room to open. Okay folks, we did some grinding on that back cover there to make some more room for the wastegate to open. And also I rounded off that edge a little bit. I don't know if that'll help much, but what the heck. Anyway, we've reached a point where this edge of the flapper valve right there is actually touching the gasket now, right there. Now, I don't want to get into modifying the gasket and all that stuff, so we're going to call it good at this point. But just for reference, the wastegate used to open only that much. Now it can open that much. So we went from here to here. It may not seem a lot, but that's like, I don't know, an extra 20 or 30%. Shouldn't hurt. Anyway, now let's finally start installing this in the car. Okay, we have a jack under the oil pan with a block of wood so we don't punch a hole in the oil pan. Now we can remove that motor mount. Oh, and here's a quick look at the motor mount. So if I take it and wiggle it, you can see the weight of the engine is not resting on the motor mount anymore. Okay, so here we have the two different motor mount setups. Of course, this is stock. Now this is not stock. This is actually a urethane mount from RevShift. But look at the height difference between these two. This, of course, is the one that goes with the turbo mount. So if you were thinking of reusing your urethane motor mount with the turbo setup, yeah, it's not going to work. Or at the very least, it's going to tilt your engine at a weird angle. Okay, so now we can remove these eBay headers. Now, I've already disconnected all the O2 sensors. So at this point, I should be able to just unbolt them. And wow, the birds are extra today. Some of these exhaust bolts I can get with a socket wrench, no big deal. But for some of these other ones, I think I'm gonna have to get creative. But that's okay, I've got different size extensions. I've also got a couple different 11mm and 7/16 inch wrenches. So yeah, we'll be fine. I mean, I got it installed, so yeah. Oh, and just FYI, I'm removing the front manifold first, because if you try to remove the back one first, the front one is actually going to be in the way. Find your happy place. Okay, one down, one to go. Alright, those eBay headers are out. And actually the hardware wasn't that difficult to remove, because when I installed the headers I put anti-seize compound on the hardware, and that paid dividends when I went to remove it. Anyway, we're going to clean up the mating surface on the cylinder head and install that turbo manifold. Okay, so once again we're using BMW M50 exhaust manifold gaskets. The metal side of the gasket will go up against the cylinder head, so this side will be touching the manifold. Also, since that manifold is not perfectly flat, I went after it with a belt sander, we're going to put a very light coating of this stuff on it. Okay, so we have the gaskets pre-installed on the engine. They're just hanging out there for now. Also, you'll notice that there's anti-seize compound on each of the studs. Okay folks, the turbo manifold is installed. Unfortunately I put some smudges on it, but whatever. Okay, now let's install that motor mount. Oh, by the way, before we install the mount bracket, I need to tell you guys a little something about the mounting bolts. These are the original bolts. Focus. The original bolts for the stock mount bracket. Now, the new bracket is not as thick. It's about, 3 millimeters difference. So if you use these bolts with the new motor mount bracket, the bolt is actually going to bottom out in the bolt hole before it tightens the bracket. Now, there are a couple different options here. First of all, you'll see the tip of the bolt has no threads on it. I've seen some people grind that part off. That'll work. I've also seen people stack washers on the bolt to make up the difference. That will also work. Now what I'm going to do is I found some bolts in my nut and bolt collection that don't have that unthreaded part on the tip, but the threaded part is basically the same length. So these shouldn't bottom out. Okay, so we have the manifold and the motor mount installed. I think now we can install the turbo. Chances are it'll have to come back out again, I'm not sure. But for now, I just want to see a turbo in my engine bay. You know what I mean?
Denied.
Houston, we have a problem. Unfortunately, that turbo will not fit in there. And it's because of all this stuff, the internal wastegate setup. This interferes with the motor mount, and actually I took this off to see if I could get the turbo installed without it. And even this part here interferes with the engine block. So this is a no-go, at least for a bottom mount. So now the question is, do I buy another turbo or do I buy a top mount manifold? Decisions. Okay guys, it's a couple weeks later, and I almost ended the video right there. As a matter of fact, I filmed an outro and everything, but we need to end this episode with a manifold and a turbo bolted to the engine, and by golly, that's what we're going to do. So, like I mentioned earlier, this turbo did not fit because, first of all, this part of the exhaust housing and the wastegate actuator interfered with the engine block, and this part interfered with the motor mount. So this is a no-go. Unfortunately, all the port work I did to the exhaust housing is now wasted. But whatever. Let's move on. So I ordered another turbo, and as you can see, the exhaust housing on this one is not as chunky as that one. Also, the wastegate bracket on this one is going to be easier to work with than that one. And spoiler alert, I already test fitted this on the car, although without the wastegate, and it fits. But with one caveat, and that is the compressor housing on this guy is slightly bigger than that one. And unfortunately, that causes it to just barely touch the motor mount. So to gain clearance for the motor mount, I had to remove this aluminum sleeve or cover or whatever you want to call it. And that gave me just enough room so the compressor housing doesn't touch the motor mount. Also, since I have to clock this turbo to get everything situated correctly, that means the mounting bracket for the wastegate actuator will need to be modified. I actually already started marking where it needs to be cut and reshaped to get everything to work correctly. I'll probably do that either off camera or in the next video. Also, since we have a new turbo, that means that we're going to have to port this exhaust housing and modify this wastegate actuator so it'll open a little bit more. But you already saw me do that on that turbo, and it's a pretty similar process. So once again, we're going to do this off camera. Maybe I'll show you the results of that in the next video. But, like I mentioned earlier, we want to end this video with a turbo bolted to the engine. So let's do that. Oh, and I think I forgot to mention, this turbo is a Chinese copy of a Holset HX30, and this one is a Chinese copy of a Garrett T3-T4 hybrid. Just FYI. Okay, so here we have it. We have the manifold, the motor mount, and the turbo installed in the BMW. And that's what I wanted to accomplish with this video, so I'm pretty happy with that. We're going to end the video here, but one comment before we finish. Once again, I'll have to modify that mounting bracket for the wastegate actuator because the stock location of the wastegate actuator is right about there, and that'll interfere with the compressor housing. So we're going to have to relocate the wastegate actuator up inside here behind the motor mount. Also, here's that clearance issue I was talking about between the compressor housing and the motor mount. It's pretty tight, but it just barely clears. Anyway, that's it for this video. Stay tuned.